when you've exhausted all possibilities. Remember this. You haven't. It was a harsh summer, the summer of '82. For many, it was as if the clocks had rolled back to the '30s and the time of the Great Depression. Company upon company declared bankruptcy. Unemployment soared. The severe and prolonged recession, as it was dubbed by the media, sent ripples of depression across America. Politicians used the depressed state of the country to their advantage. It provided a great opportunity to highlight the failures, shortcomings, and faults of the opposite political party. Democrats found in it an opportunity to blame the Republican administration which was in charge. Predictably, the Republicans, in turn, blamed the Democratic administration that created the problem which the Republicans had inherited. Everybody was fixing the blame. Nobody was fixing the problem. The problem persisted. They grew. The recession ran rampant across the country until nearly everyone was affected by it. No one was immune. I, personally, felt it as pastor of the Crystal Cathedral congregation and head of a national television ministry, which was broadcast on 169 television stations every week. With 500 people on the payroll, we were operating on a budget of well over $20 million a year. The cost of operations continued to increase dramatically. Like the rest of America, we too were faced with tough economic times. No one could deny that the country had problems. But the biggest problem we had was our attitude toward the economic problem. Negative thinking spread like a plague through all levels of society. It was not easy to protect oneself from the infection of negative thinking, which spread by word of mouth, by conversations with friends as well as strangers, by television screens, and by radio news reports. It spread quickly because in recessive times the tendency is to react negatively. Once an organism, a business, a life, or a country is infected with negative thinking, the infection attacks the mind, the heart, and the soul like termites that secretly gnaw away at the emotional support system. It was in the midst of this national mood that I arrived at the Hilton Hotel in downtown Chicago. I was there to present a motivational lecture at a major convention. 5/120. Tough times never last, but tough people do. Robert H.Schuller. Delivering lectures of inspiration, as well as on successful management principles, was nothing new to me. Each year I travel from coast to coast, giving nearly 100 talks to doctors, executives, educators, you name it. However, I was particularly fascinated by this engagement. My audience would be members of the AG industry. AG is, of course, the abbreviation for agriculture. This industry represents those who are involved in the farming enterprises of the Midwest states of Iowa, Michigan, Illinois, and Minnesota. Having been born and reared on an Iowa farm, I looked upon this as an opportunity to touch base with some of the people that came from the same soil I left 40 years before. My anticipation of a warm, inspirational evening was quickly doused by a couple of somber-looking gentlemen. The convention badges pinned to their dark lapels identified them as the men for whom I was looking. They greeted me with restrained enthusiasm. "Dr. Schuller? Thank you for coming." Their words reminded me of the thousands of times I have arrived at some scene of tragedy. In hospitals, mortuaries, courtrooms, and cemeteries, I have heard those words, "Thank you for coming." I couldn't help feeling that I had arrived at the scene of some tragedy, rather than at a motivational convention. The younger man spoke. "There are 3,500 people in there waiting to hear you speak." His companion interrupted. "These people are going through tough times. They don't want to hear your funny stories. They don't want to see you grinning from ear to ear like you do on television. They don't want a pat on the back with a hollow promise that everything is going to be okay." At that point, both men moved shoulder to shoulder to face me as if they meant to block me from entering the platform. The first man spoke up. "That's right, Dr. Schuller. These people are losing their farms. Their businesses are going bankrupt. Terrible pressures are being placed on their marriages and families. They need help. And more than anything else, they need hope. Give it to them." With that admonishment, they nodded to the sound man, who pinned the microphone to my suit. As he did, I heard through the thin wall that separated the backstage area from the speaker's platform the master of ceremonies introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker. His name is Dr. Robert Schuller. He is the pastor of the world-famous Crystal Cathedral. This beautiful building was built at a cost of over $20 million and was dedicated virtually debt-free. No minister or priest or rabbi speaks to more people every week in the world or in the United States of America than does Dr. Robert Schuller from Garden Grove, California. It's our pleasure now to welcome one of the world's most successful men, Dr. Robert Schuller. Let's give him a great welcome. The sound of enthusiastic applause surrounded me as I stepped on stage to face this collection of depressed souls. 3,500 people were on their feet applauding me. The grand ballroom was packed to capacity. Inwardly, I shuddered. My carefully planned speech had just gone out the window. The 3 jokes I was prepared to tell for my own pleasure and for the purpose of warming up my audience now seemed out of place. I found myself walking across the stage without the faintest idea of what I would tell these troubled people. I paced myself quietly from one end of the platform to the other, trying to collect my thoughts. I searched the eyes of the audience. I recalled the words of the stern, welcoming committee. I decided to recover my position by asking question. They tell me that you are having tough times. Is that right? The question gave me time to embrace a dramatic pause. Such a pause can be a lifesaver to a public speaker. I continued to pace back and forth, pretending to exude the confidence of a well-prepared lecturer. I could tell that my opening question had grabbed their attention, probably more effectively than the 3 funny stories I had carefully placed in my front pocket. From that point on, I delivered a spontaneous lecture that at times erupted with new insights. Wanting desperately to help these people and give them hope, I decided to address myself specifically to the pressing problems of these men and women who represented an industry vital to the health and welfare of our country. They represented the core of the breadbasket of America. The food in the markets and on the tables of our country comes from the labor and the leadership of these agriculture businessmen and women. I remembered years ago what I was taught in my undergraduate studies in public speaking, lecturing, debating, and oratorical work in Hope College, Holland, Michigan, and again in my training at Western Theological Seminary in preparation for delivering sermons and talks from pulpits. The most effective speech is not a sermon but a witness. Essentially, the principle is this: if you don't have any advice to give, you can always share your own story. If there has been any excitement, challenge, crises, and resolution in your life, then share it. Everybody likes a good story. Drawing on this principle, I decided to share with the farmers how I handled the tough times in my life. I suspected that my audience was not aware of the fact that I, too, had tough times. My introduction portrayed me only as a very successful man, senior minister, founder, and builder of a $20 million, internationally acclaimed work of art called the Crystal Cathedral. They could only perceive me as very successful. They had not been told that I, too, had walked a path similar to the one they were now walking. Should I tell them about the time a 20 below zero blizzard raged through the lonely blackness of an Iowa night? Should I tell them how the wind whistled around the fragile country house, successfully penetrating the cracks between the window frame in the northwest corner of my bedroom, leaving fresh drifts of snow on the floor beside my bed? Should I tell them how we didn't have the money to buy coal to warm the house? Should I tell them how we raced to escape with our lives from a tornado? Should I tell them how we survived the great drought when the shortage of natural rainfall parched the earth and proved more devastating and destructive than the shortage of cash flow that had already hit all of the Americans in the Great Depression? Should I tell them about my struggles to get through college? Should I tell them about the fire in my rooming house in which I lost the few possessions I had? Should I tell them how I had to struggle to start a church with only $500 in a Strange state without friends, contacts, property, or community support. Should I tell them about my wife's bout with cancer? The near loss of my daughter's life in a motorcycle accident? The amputation of her leg? Should I share with them our struggles of the past 3 years, as we have tried to help her accommodate effectively to life as a young teenager with a disfigured left stump of a leg? Should I tell them how I was forced by circumstances beyond my control to build the Crystal Cathedral when I didn't want to build it, didn't have the money, and knew well enough that I would be criticized for building a monument? I decided not to pour out my whole life story, but I did decide to begin with the realities of the tough times I had been through and how they had been handled successfully through a faith based on possibility thinking. Farming life has never been easy. My boyhood farm was a typical Midwestern farm. That meant it was small. The industry was not simple crop farming. The crops were harvested and fed to livestock. Chickens laid the eggs, which was traded for groceries. Cows grazed the grassland along the river that was too difficult to plow. We milked the cows and sold the milk. When the hogs reached their prime weight, they were sold at market. It was a one-crop-a-year farm. That meant that we planted the oats and the corn in the springtime and harvested in the fall to be gathered into barns and saved for feed for the hogs. The winter season was merely a time of survival, waiting and hoping for spring. My father purchased our farm when prices were at their peak. Real estate had been climbing steadily. I was born only a few years later, September 16, 1926. How my father saved enough to buy our farm is a story in itself. Because he lost his parents. As a teenager, Dad was forced to drop out of school in the 6th grade and to find the only job he could as a hired hand for the local farmers. One could always husk corn, rip each single golden ear from its nest of leaves, crack off the 6-foot stem, and throw it into the He hoped that the seeds would become wet and bloated until they erupted with new life, sending their tender little sprouts up through the softened spring soil. Light green rows of corn would begin to grow and stand out against the black background of the dark Iowa ground. Rainfall is essential to a farmer's success, and Iowa farmers can expect rain to fall at least once every other week. If for some reason the rains did not fall for 3 or 4 weeks, 1 inch of the topsoil would dry out first. Then, if rain still did not come, the soil would gradually grow dry at 2, 3, 4, 5 inches deep until the hair-like tentacles of the roots of the new corn plants would die. The first evidence of the death of the roots would be a wilted leaf. When the rains did not fall for 2 weeks, my father was worried. When the 3rd and 4th weeks passed with no rain, I saw his face grow very grave. Not once did he become angry. Never did he miss praying with bowed head at the table before our morning, noon, or nighttime meals. The only thing my father did about the drought was pray. That was the only thing he could do. Farmers gathered from miles around at special prayer meetings, filling the little white churches that dotted the rolling landscapes. Out of respect and reverence to the Almighty God, each farmer came, not in his overalls, but in his one and only suit and tie. They called upon God Almighty to save their land and their crops. They asked him to send rain. Then all they could do was to go home and wait for his answer. For a whole year the Lord was silent. Day after day, the sun bore down on the crops. Every day, we thirstily scanned the scorching sky for a sign of a cloud. More than once I ran into the house calling out, "I've seen a cloud." God may be answering our prayer, but the clouds always dissipate. Finally, as if in fact our prayers were being answered, there was a gathering of clouds. Hopes began to rise again. The desperately needed rainfall was moving in from the west. Flashed of lightning slashed through the black sky. Thunder cracked. The trees trembled with fright as the wind whipped through their branches. It rained. I was jubilant, but my father did not share my enthusiasm. Neither did my mother, for they knew what I did not know. The rain was totally inadequate. When the last thunderclap echoed in the distance, signaling the passing of the storm. The sun came out bright and hot. Again, we walked outdoors. My father scooped up a handful of the wet, moistened surface.
Soil.
Only the top quarter-inch was wet and black. Below that the earth was powdery dry. Then the winds began to blow, from where we did not know. The sky turned from bright blue to a drab gray to a dirty brown. And the clean, bright air that I enjoyed breathing as a child suddenly became polluted with dust. "That's South Dakota, land you are breathing, son," my father said. South Dakota, the state that bordered Iowa on the northwest, was suffering a worse drought than Iowa. It did not even enjoy the sporadic showers that moistened the surface soil. The barren land, devoid of any vegetation, lay helpless before the gathering winds. They swept the feathery particles of earth high into the sky, carrying them hundreds of miles to the east. Like drifts of snow, the dust settled on our farm. When the winds blew harder, the dust sandblasted the few rows of corn that had managed to survive the
Drought.
The fragile young plants, wilted and weakened for want of refreshing water, were no match for the grit driven by the hot winds. There was total devastation. Here and there, like bones of a dead animal, dead corn stalks protruded above the drift of dry sand. Still the winds did not cease. It became a common procedure for my brother, sisters, and me to cover our faces with wet clothes as we walked the short distance from our house to the outdoor toilet. When we walked to the well, where we hoped we would be able to pump water from the 40-foot reservoir, we would have to protect ourselves from the suffocating dust with our moistened masks. Our water became more and more scarce as the meandering snake of a river dried up.
The
Floyd River had been my closest childhood friend. On its green banks, near open pastures, I would lie, watching the clouds change shape in the blue sky. It was there that I felt closest to my Creator. I became incurably addicted to God's natural green gardens. Years later, I would hope and dream of a place where I would worship and see the sky above me, day and night. Years later, I would dream of a church that could allow all of the sky to permeate our troubled minds, with its peace, bringing healing from worry and anxiety. Years later, I would find that dream fulfilled in a crystal cathedral. But during the summer of the Great Drought, I watched the river dry up. Little pools of water became mud holes where squirming bullhead catfish died.
We were surrounded by death.
The river was dead, the fish were dead, and most importantly, the crops were dead. Summer finally gave way to fall. Newspapers nationwide proclaimed the Midwest Farm Belt to be in total disaster. Even the New York bankers and corporate chiefs became concerned about a plague that was as great, if not greater, than their own economic depression.
The
breadbasket of America was in ruins. If it had been a normal year, my father would have expected to harvest corn that would fill dozens of wagons. That year, my father harvested barely a half a wagon of corn, grown on a half-acre of ground. In a normal year, this swampy lot, fed by some mysterious underground spring, was too wet to produce any fruit at all. My father had often thought about digging deep into that plot to drain the subsurface water
away.
Now in the year of the drought, this small plot of ground was the only parcel out of 160 acres where the corn had survived. Here the corn lived, drawing moisture from a subterranean source. Here the corn grew nearly 6 feet tall. And here we harvested the minuscule crop. It was but half a wagon of corn. A total disaster? Not quite. For a half a wagon of corn was better than none at all. In fact, it was equal to the amount of seed that had been sowed earlier that year. A total loss?
No. We
gained nothing. But most importantly, we lost nothing. I shall never forget my father's dinner-time prayer that night. Dear Lord, I thank you that I have lost nothing this year. You have given me my seed back. Thank you. Not all farmers had as much faith as my father did. For sale sign began to appear on farm after farm. Discouraged farmers who could not imagine that things would get better packed up and abandon their land. Other farmers simply threw their hands up in despair and allowed the bank to foreclose. More than one piece of property sold on the courthouse steps. Years later, I asked my father how he had survived. After all, he had had no cash reserves. He had had no rich relatives. I went to the bank, my father said, and I promised them that if they would help me, somehow I'd return their money. I pleaded with them to refinance, rearrange the mortgage, postpone the due date. For some reason, the bank believed in me and it helped. I remember that bank. I have early childhood memories of going there, in patched overalls, with my father. I recall seeing this slogan on a calendar in that bank: great people are ordinary people with extraordinary amounts of determination. I'm convinced that that slogan exemplified the positive attitude of my father and inspired the bankers to go along with him and give him an extension on his mortgage payment. That slogan was an explanation of my father's success and an inspiration to me to attempt the impossible too. For I had dreams of my own to go to college and seminary. Some years later, on a quiet June afternoon, the tornado struck. I had not unpacked my suitcases, having returned only a few days before for the summer recess from my college studies. Throughout the afternoon, my dad and I could hear an awesome roar reverberating, like the hum of a mighty organ. The eerie sound was like many freight trains rumbling above the threatening and gathering clouds. "Sounds like we're in for a hailstorm," my dad murmured. In a desperate attempt to protect his prize roses, we rounded up empty pails and wooden boxes to cover every treasured bush. It was 6 o'clock now. We had finished our evening meal in haste. From the vantage point of our front lawn, we could see more than a mile across the rolling farmland. The sun was lost now, seemingly swallowed by the black monstrous storm that was prowling the western sky. Slowly, with alarming stillness like a tiger crawling up on a sleeping prey, the storm crept closer. Gusts of hot wind blew the dry dust of the country road. The old box elder bent before the mounting winds. Out in the pasture, a cow bellowed frantically, calling her little calf to come to her side for safety. My riding horse seemed to sense impending disaster. He cut a commanding picture, standing erect, with head held high, graceful neck arched. His tail, lifted slightly, fanned in the wind. His ears searched the air for sounds of danger. Suddenly, a black lump, about the size of the sun, bulged out of the black sky. In an instant it telescoped to the ground in a long gray funnel. For a moment it hung suspended, like a slithering serpent, about to strike death to helpless victims below. Dad called to Mom, "It's a tornado, Jenny." I asked excitedly, "Are you sure it's a real tornado, Dad?" My first emotion was delightful
Excitement.
This would be something to tell the fellows when I returned to Hope College in the fall. The funnel seemed so small, I couldn't imagine the fury that could be unleashed from such a funny cloud. "Call Mother, son, and tell her to take whatever she can grab and come to the car. We've got to get out of here right away." A moment later, we were driving crazily down the road. We lived on the east end of a dead end and had to drive a mile west, directly into the path of the oncoming tornado in order to reach the side road that led south, away from the path of the storm. We made it. 2 miles south, we parked our car on the crest of the hill and watched the wicked twister spend its killing power. As quickly and quietly as it had dropped, it lifted and disappeared.
It
Was all over. The storm was gone. The air was deathly still, but the danger was past. Gentle raindrops now began to fall. The tail end of the dark sky dropped a soothing shower of cool rain, as if heaven were pouring a soothing balm on fresh wounds. We could go home now. Oh, God, will we find our house? We reached the crossroads, only to find a long line of cars. Curious sightseers, sensing that something terrible had happened, already were gathering. They were looking at the complete destruction of a neighboring farm. Wondering if our house had been spared, we drove down the lonely road, crisscrossed by wires from broken telephone poles, toward our secluded farm. We came to the base of the hill that hid the view of our house. Before, we had been able to see the peak of our barn.
But not now.
We knew before we went over the hill that our barn was gone. Now we were on the top of the hill. We saw it. Everything was gone. Where only a half hour before there had been 9 buildings, freshly painted, now there were none.
Where?
There had been life. There was the silence of death. It was all gone, all dead. Only white foundations remain, lying on a clean patch of black ground. There was no debris. Everything had simply been sucked up and carried away. 3 little pigs, still living, suckled the breasts of their dead mother, lying in the driveway. We could hear the sickening moan of dying cattle, the hiss of gas escaping from a portable tank of butane used to provide fuel for our stove. Then I saw my riding horse, lying dead with a 14-foot-long two-by-four piercing his belly. Dazed, our brains reeling, we sat in our car. My father was past 60 and had worked hard for 26 years to try to win this farm. The mortgage was about due. This seemed to kill all chances of ever saving the place from the creditors. I looked at my dad, sitting horror-stricken, white-haired, underweight from overwork, his hands blue, desperately gripping the steering wheel. Suddenly, those calloused hands with their bulging blood vessels began hitting the steering wheel of the car, and Dad cried, "It's all gone. Jenny, Jenny, it's all gone." 26 years. Jenny, and it's all gone in 10 minutes. Dad got out of the car, ordering us to wait, and walked with his cane around the clean-swept, tornado-vacuumed farmyard. We later found out that our house had been dropped in one smashed piece, a half-mile out in the pasture. We had had a little sign on the kitchen wall, a little molded plaster motto. Its simple verse was, "Keeping looking to Jesus." My dad found and carried to the car the broken top half. Keeping looking, well, this was God's message to Dad. Keep looking. Keep looking. Don't quit now. Don't sell out. Dig in and hold on. And he did. People thought my dad was finished, but he was not. He was not finished because he would not give up. He had faith. With hanging on power, there's one ingredient that mountain-moving faith, miracle-generating faith, earth-shaking faith, problem-solving faith, and situation-changing faith must have, and that ingredient is holding power. So, Dad didn't quit. 2 weeks later, we found in a nearby town an old house that was being torn down. A section of it was available for sale for $50. So we bought this remnant and took it apart, piece by piece. We saved every nail and every shingle, and from these pieces we built a new little house on the old home farm. One by one, additional farm buildings were built. 9 farms were demolished in that tornado, but my father was the only farmer to rebuild a completely demolished farm. A few years later, prices rose sharply. Farm products prospered. Within 5 years, the mortgage was paid off. My father died a successful man. One. So you're having tough times. Are they tougher times than my father experienced? I looked deep into the eyes and the hearts of the new generation of Iowa farmers. Are you burning corn cobs for fuel? Have you lost everything in a tornado? Is the mortgage due and the cash not there? Are you tempted to walk away and put the place up for sale? Then let me tell you something about tough times. I believe I have walked the path and have earned the right to comment on tough times. Let me tell you something about tough times. Tough times never last, but tough people do. The place broke up with applause. Those 3,500 farmers who had lost hope and had battled depression found that hope. They caught a new vision and began to dream again. Are you facing tough times today? Overwhelmed? I invite you to take a walk with me. Let me tell you about survivors and how you can be one too. In the process, your life will become a light for someone else's pathway. The path is called the possibility thinking path. I've been preaching it for years. It has never let me down. It has never let anybody down. IT never quits on us. We may quit the path, but the path keeps right on going on to happiness, health, and prosperity. 14/120. Tough times never last, but tough people do. Robert H. Schuller. Nobody is a total failure if he dares to try to do something worthwhile. 1. The tornado story is an excerpt from Move Ahead with Possibility Thinking. Copyright 1967 by Robert H. Schuller. Reprinted by permission of Doubleday and Company Incorporated.
2.
But tough people do. Newt Rockne said it. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. When the roads are rough, the tough rise to the occasion. They win. They survive. They come out on top. People are like potatoes. After potatoes have been harvested, they have to be spread out and sorted in order to get the maximum market dollar. They're divided according to size, big, medium, and small. It is only after potatoes have been sorted and bagged that they are loaded onto trucks. This is the method that all Idaho potato farmers use, all but one. One farmer never bothered to sort the potatoes at all, yet he seemed to be making the most money. A puzzled neighbor finally asked him, "What is your secret?" He said, "It's simple. I just load up the wagon with potatoes and take the roughest road to town. During the 8-mile trip, the little potatoes always fall to the bottom. The medium potatoes land in the middle, while the big potatoes rise to the top." That's not only true to potatoes. It is a law of
Life.
big potatoes rise to the top on rough roads, and tough people rise to the top in rough
Times.
Tough times never last, but tough people do. Possibility thinking works. It worked for my father, it has worked for me, and I've seen it work for men and women who heard me preach it. I preached it, they practiced it, and here is what happened. Mary Martin. As I was working on this book, I received a beautiful letter from a person I had never met but had admired from a distance. 6 times Mary Martin's picture has appeared on the cover of. Then I lost my voice and was unable to sing. That was like losing my life. Then one morning a possibility thinking message inspired an idea that led me to health again.
My
singing voice returned, sparkling with joy as she shared the event. She looked as young and attractive at 69 as she must have looked when she was a bright, young starlet beginning her career. I could hardly believe that she had come out of the hospital only weeks before, following a car crash that had claimed 1 life and almost 2 others. I had seen her interview on the Today Show not long before, and she had walked with a walker. After all, she had broken her pelvis in 2 places and had come dangerously close to
death.
Now, having celebrated her 69th birthday, she had not only recovered, she walked without a limp. "Of course, I have some trouble with arthritis and cataracts," she laughed heartily. Her eyes twinkled and flashed with exuberance and youthfulness, almost belying her confession. Then she told me the terrible story of the accident as it had happened a few months before. She, along with her dearest female friend, Janet Gaynor, and her dearest male companion and manager, Ben Washer, had stepped into a cab in San Francisco. Ben insisted, "Please get in first, Mary." I obliged. "You're next," Ben said to Janet, who slipped in the middle of the back seat. Then Ben, like a gentleman, followed and closed the door behind him. Because of this seating arrangement, Ben bore the immediate impact of the speeding car, driven by a drunken driver who ran a red light. The impact was horrible.
Ben
was killed, and Janet spent month after torturing month lingering near death, finally recovering enough to be able to return home to Palm Springs for Christmas. "I think maybe that was one of my toughest times," Mary Martin said. Without losing the twinkle, she continued, "But as you say, tough times never last, but tough people do.
And
I'm a tough Texan, you know? What gives some person the power to fight on after the loss of a precious loved one, after experiencing torturing physical pain day after day? There is no substitute for deep abiding
faith.
If we hold on, we will win out." Unquestionably, the profound faith and the beautiful providence of God produce a strong and unquenchable optimistic mental attitude. Richard Rodgers told me that he wrote the song Cockeyed Optimist for me. Mary spoke softly, humbly, yet she was very pleased. She continued, "He was writing the play, South Pacifics, and he said to me, "Mary, when I knew you'd be playing the part of Nellie, I simply thought about you and wrote the words." And he was right, you know. I am stuck like a dope with a thing called hope. That's the spirit that heals all diseases, redeems lives from destruction, and brings sunshine back after the rain. Tough people have it. And they can weather the worst storm. They can rough out the toughest times. They win. They come out on top. I met Benno Fischer in 1960 in the Richard Neutra architectural office where he served the prestigious Los Angeles firm as one of the associate architects. Richard Neutra, Benno Fischer, and I spent many days together sketching the architectural dream church. I noticed KL tattooed in bluish letters, 1 inch high, on Benno's left hand. Beneath it were tattooed 8 numbers, each approximately 1/4 inch high. "What does the KL stand for, Benno?" I asked. Surprised, he looked at me. "You mean you don't know?" I said, "No, really. What does the KL stand for?" "Oh," he said, "it stands for Konzentrationslager. That's German for concentration camp." And then he unfolded his story. It took place in Warsaw, Poland, in 1939. Benno Fischer and his sweetheart were in love and were planning their marriage when the German army took the city. In the terrible confusion that followed, Benno was loaded on a truck and was taken, along with other Jews, to a concentration camp where he would be confined until 1945. Where's my end, he wondered those first days, which eventually stretched into tormenting weeks and horrifying months. Unknown to him, and hearing of the impending disaster that was falling upon her city, had slipped through dark alleys. In disguise, she managed to slip out of Germany by successfully passing herself off as a non-Jew. She assumed Benno was dead. But Benno was one of 4,000 Jews in the concentration camp, each of whom was offered a daily cube of bread and a bowl of soup. The soup, of course, was far more satisfying. It extended the stomach and relieved the painful, empty feeling that a cube of bread hardly satisfied. Trading bread for soup became, for many inmates, a major activity of
the day.
Benno was offered cubes of bread by more than one fellow inmate. He always agreed to the transaction. As the time of the liberation approached, the camp's population dwindled from 4,000 to 400. In a desperate effort, the Nazi Gestapo tied the feet of the remaining prisoners to each other and led them off on a long, cold march through the snow of the late winter season. Emaciated and disease-ridden, many dropped from exhaustion and were left to freeze in the snow. Then came that unforgettable morning. A rumble of heavy engines was heard from over the hill. Then on the horizon there appeared tanks, approaching quickly through the melting
snow.
GIs with American flags overtook the pitiful, tragic cordon of surviving Jews. Benno Fischer was set free. Freedom. Benno's first act was to search for his beloved, and was she dead? Was she alive? I heard someone say he thought he saw her in Stuttgart. He was told by another survivor. On a long shot, he went to Stuttgart. While riding a bus through the city, he suddenly recognized a lovely young lady standing in the corner. He jumped off and whirled her
around.
He looked at her. She stared at him. In the depth of their eyes, they recognized the love that would not die. And Benno said, "Benno." They embraced, they cried, they laughed, they loved, they survived. And they came to America. Tough times never last, but tough people do. John Prunty. John Prunty was known throughout his community as the Roadrunner Man, for in 1965, running had not become the popular endeavor it is today. There were the usual guffaws and good-natured chiding during his early morning jaunts. On June 6, 1973, John took his usual 21-minute run, not knowing it would be his last. Later that morning, John, along with the rest of the 5-member construction crew, scrambled onto the roof of a small home. It was one of those hot, oppressive days, and the work was difficult. John was atop a scaffold when his foreman called to him for a tool.
In
reaching for it, John stepped forward, and instantly a cinder block pulled loose and gave way. Under his weight, John fought the impulse to jump, thinking that he could regain his balance and avoid breaking an ankle on the uneven turf some 10 feet below. But it was too late. John was already airborne and out of control from his momentum. He seemed to float, as if in a suspended, weightless state, similar to flying in outer space. His flight ended with terrible finality. His 160 pounds landed with full force upon his head, and, as John tells it, I still shudder when I recall the sickening, grinding sound of crunching vertebrae as they snapped under the strain. My body's trajectory, coupled with its momentum, tried to force my forehead against my chest in pretzel-like fashion. Instantly, I was aware I had lost feeling. In my legs, waves of fear, anger, and utter frustration assaulted me in those first seconds as my immediate efforts to get up proved futile. Only my head would respond to my brain's
commands.
I heard a yell from above. "Hey, John's fallen." I alternately cursed and prayed. I turned my head to the left and saw, a few inches away, a pair of booted feet, toes facing me, which looked grotesquely like my own. That's strange. Though my legs are outstretched. But they weren't, and the subsequent realization was terrifying. I felt no pain until someone lifted my head slightly to place a pillow under it. Then the pain was so severe that I had to request him to remove the pillow. I felt as if my head were suspended only by a thread. Every time I rotated it, even slightly, the pain increased and 18/120. Tough times never last, but tough people do. Robert H.Schuller gave me the weird idea that the thread would break and my head would detach. I struggled to stay conscious. Surprisingly soon, the rescue squad arrived and efficiently went about preparing to place a stretcher beneath me. I dreaded the move, for by now the pain had become quite severe.
I
Was comforted, however, by the squad's professionalism as they reassured me and tried to minimize the effects of my trauma. Once inside the ambulance, I began to feel a little better, comforted by the belief that I would soon be in the care of experts who would set everything straight. At the hospital, the neurosurgeon who took my case had me lifted onto an X-ray table.
He
Then climbed up on hands and knees to pull and tug at my head to achieve the needed angles of pictures. Though I had known pain before, I was sure I had never experienced anything
like this.
A short time later, the doctor brought me the unhappy confirmation that my neck was indeed broken between the 5th and 6th cervical vertebrae.
I had learned to pray as a
child, so now once again, I turned to God and prayed for strength to endure whatever was ahead in life's uncertain road. The nights seemed interminable, and I spent agonizing hours reliving the outrageous events of the day over and over again. But through the pain and confusion of a traumatic, potentially mortal, and life-changing injury came the memory of the words from our wheelchair president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. All we have to fear is fear itself. Following that was a positive reaction, a rededication, and reaffirmation of love. There were prayers of supplication to God, whose master plan undoubtedly was to unfold in the coming days, and there were prayers of thanksgiving for life that had been preserved for another endeavor. But the real battle was yet to come. I was abruptly reminded, when I awoke, of the tongs which protruded from both sides of my head. The more quietly I lay, I soon discovered, the less the pain. I felt as if I were wrapped like a mummy from the chest down. That was frightening, because it meant the feeling was gone. There were gadgets and meters all around me. A nurse, whom I assumed to be virtually omniscient and omnipotent, seemed to have the power to intervene at a moment's notice if anything went awry. I had never before been hospitalized, and the entire environment was foreign to me. It was like living out a novel I must have read at some time or another. During the following weeks, it became more apparent that the major effects of John's injury would be permanent. He continued to hold out hope, though, that a miracle would occur and mend the spinal cord to the extent that it could again process messages, any message from the brain. With this in mind, John began to concentrate on recovery. He became interested in discovering as much as possible about just what it was he needed to recover from. He didn't even have to ask, for one day John overheard one of the nurses commenting to an aide in reference to him, "That's the way quadriplegics are." John had never before seen a quadriplegic. In fact, he could not spell the word, though suddenly he was one. In that moment of truth, this young husband and father knew he was a quadriplegic, a victim of broken neck, paralyzed from the neck down for life. But he was alive. It was a tough time, but no one's tougher than John. He said, "I decided to be a survivor." In fact, 3Ds became my guiding theme: desire, dedication, and determination. I knew I needed to generate and sustain the desire to live, to heal, and to recognize my true potential. Then I had to dedicate myself to that concept. Determination alone would give me the victory. I resolved never to surrender. Today, after more than 8 years in a wheelchair, John claims that life is every bit as good as ever. He says, "I know there is no place in my life for recrimination, bitterness, or hate. I fervently believe that to hate is to destroy. I want instead to love, and in so doing, to demonstrate that, regardless of body impairment, the heart retains its divinely ordained function." I recognized now that the truly handicapped are those who measure beauty by the sole prerequisite of physical perfection. I decided my accident was something I could never escape from.
It would become a
millstone around my neck, or, if I practiced possibility thinking, I could turn my millstone into a milestone. I decided to do just that. I have accepted me as I am rather than as I wish I
were.
I need but to smile or wink at a wide-eyed child in the supermarket as I buzz down the aisles in my electric wheelchair to elicit a comment like one youngster made recently. "Gosh, you're lucky." John does more than wink or smile at children. Today he manages his own business, serving surrounding hotels and his community with a professional babysitter placement service.
He
also gives many hours as a volunteer counselor in the New Hope Crisis Telephone Counseling Center in the Crystal Cathedral. Because of the new hope he has found, he is able to give new hope to the discouraged people he counsels. John Prunty's a winner. He's a survivor because he knows that tough times never last, but tough people do. H.Schuller. About the same 4-year period, we watched our daughter, Carol, move from a hospital to the ski slopes. When we arrived from Korea to Carol's bedside in Sioux City, Iowa, after her motorcycle accident, I was shocked. She lay in her bed in intensive care. Her body was bruised, broken,
and disfigured,
but her spirits were whole and healthy. On the long trip back, I had searched for my opening line. What would my first words to her be? She solved the problem by speaking first. "I know why it happened, Dad. God wants to use me to help others who have been hurt." 20/120. Tough times never last, but tough people do. Robert H.Schuller. It was this spirit, this positive attitude, that carried her through several months of hospitalization, intravenous feedings, and consequent collapsed veins. This positive attitude gave her the courage to fight a raging infection that threatened her limb and her life. She hung on until a new drug was released by the FDA. It was the right drug at the right time. A real miracle. It was that same positive attitude that helped Carol make the transition from hospital patient to a handicapped member of a family and school. It helped her feel normal and whole again. She refused to allow the inconvenience of an artificial limb to keep her from pursuing the active life she loved, including softball. The last picture we have of Carol with both legs is one taken when she was in her softball uniform. The athlete of the family, Carol loves to play softball. The summer after her accident, she shocked me by saying, "Dad, I'm going to sign up for softball again this year." "That's great," I responded, not wanting to discourage her. At that time, Carol's artificial leg was attached just below the knee. She was plagued by a stiff knee that could barely bend at a 30-degree angle. She walked very stiffly. Running was out of the question. However, I took her to the local school where all the parents were lining up with their girls to sign up for the girls' softball team. Carol signed up and went to check out her uniform. As she swung her stiff plastic leg into the car and rested her jersey, socks, and cap in her lap, I turned to her and said, "Carol, how you expect to play ball if you can't run?" With flashing eyes, she snapped back at me, "I've got that all figured out, Dad. When you hit home runs, you don't have to run. My daughter is tough. She's a survivor. I want you to know that she hit enough home runs that season to justify her presence on the team." Carol has learned a lesson too. Tough times never last, but tough people do. She has had 6 surgeries since that first amputation. Today she is skiing and has met her goal, which was to win a gold medal in the qualifying races that, in turn, admitted her to that elite corps of skiers participating in the National Ski Championships. In March 1983, she pulled her goggles on and took her place among the champions in the country at the young age of 18 years. Yes, she still walks with a limp. She draws curious looks from strangers, but her positive attitude helps her even with that. Last summer, my family and I were privileged to be the guest of the American Hawaiian Steamship Company on a 1-week cruise of the Hawaiian Islands. It was absolutely beautiful. On this cruise, it is customary on the last night to have a talent show in which any of the passengers can participate. Carol, then 17 years old, surprised us one day by saying, "I'm going to be in the talent show tonight." In that moment of truth, this young husband and father knew he was a quadriplegic, a victim of broken neck, paralyzed from the neck down for life. But he was alive. It was a tough time, but no one's tougher than John. He said, "I decided to be a survivor." In fact, 3 Ds became my guiding theme: desire, dedication, and determination. I knew I needed to generate and sustain the desire to live, to heal, and to recognize my true potential. Then I had to dedicate myself to that concept. Determination alone would give me the victory. I resolved never to surrender. Today, after more than 8 years in a wheelchair, John claims that life is every bit as good as ever. He says, "I know there is no place in my life for recrimination, bitterness, or hate. I fervently believe that to hate is to destroy. I want instead to love, and in so doing, to demonstrate that, regardless of body impairment, the heart retains its divinely ordained function." I recognized now that the truly handicapped are those who measure beauty by the sole prerequisite of physical perfection. I decided my accident was something I could never escape from.
It would become a
millstone around my neck, or if I practiced possibility thinking, I could turn my millstone into a milestone. I decided to do just that. I have accepted me as I am rather than as I wish I
were.
I need but to smile or wink at a wide-eyed child in the supermarket as I buzz down the aisles in my electric wheelchair to elicit a comment like one youngster made recently. "Gosh, you're lucky." John does more than wink or smile at children. Today he manages his own business serving surrounding hotels and his community with a professional babysitter placement service. He also gives many hours as a volunteer counselor in the New Hope Crisis Telephone Counseling Center in the Crystal Cathedral. Because of the new hope he has found, he is able to give new hope to the discouraged people he counsels. John Prunty's a winner. He's a survivor because he knows that tough times never last, but tough people do. H.Schuller. About the same 4-year period, we watched our daughter, Carol, move from a hospital to the ski slopes. When we arrived from Korea to Carol's bedside in Sioux City, Iowa, after her motorcycle accident, I was shocked. She lay in her bed in intensive care. Her body was bruised, broken, and disfigured, but her spirits were whole and healthy. On the long trip back, I had searched for my opening line. What would my first words to her
B.
She solved the problem by speaking first. I know why it happened, Dad. God wants to use me to help others who have been hurt. 20/120. Tough times never last, but tough people do. Robert H.Schuller. It was this spirit, this positive attitude, that carried her through several months of hospitalization, intravenous feedings, and consequent collapsed veins. This positive attitude gave her the courage to fight a raging infection that threatened her limb and her life.
She
Hung on until a new drug was released by the FDA. It was the right drug at the right time. A real miracle. It was that same positive attitude that helped Carol make the transition from hospital patient to a handicapped member of a family and school. It helped her feel normal and whole. Again, she refused to allow the inconvenience of an artificial limb to keep her from pursuing the active life she loved, including softball. The last picture we have of Carol with both legs is one taken when she was in her softball uniform. The athlete of the family, Carol loves to play softball. The summer after her accident, she shocked me by saying, "Dad, I'm going to sign up for softball again this year." "That's great," I responded, not wanting to discourage her. At that time, Carol's artificial leg was attached just below the knee. She was plagued by a stiff knee that could barely bend at a 30-degree angle. She walked very stiffly. Running was out of the question. However, I took her to the local school where all the parents were lining up with their girls to sign up for the girls' softball team. Carol signed up and went to check out her uniform. As she swung her stiff plastic leg into the car and rested her jersey, socks, and cap in her lap, I turned to her and said, "Carol, how do you expect to play ball if you can't run?" With flashing eyes, she snapped back at me, "I've got that all figured out, Dad. When you hit home runs, you don't have to run. My daughter is tough. She's a survivor. I want you to know that she hit enough home runs that season to justify her presence on the team." Carol has learned the lesson too. Tough times never last, but tough people do. She has had 6 surgeries since that first amputation. Today she is skiing and has met her goal, which was to win a gold medal in the qualifying races that, in turn, admitted her to that elite core of skiers participating in the National Ski Championships. In March 1983, she pulled her goggles on and took her place among the champions in the country at the young age of 18 years. Yes, she still walks with a limp. She draws curious looks from strangers, but her positive attitude helps her even with that. Last summer, my family and I were privileged to be the guest of the American Hawaiian Steamship Company on a 1-week cruise of the Hawaiian Islands. It was absolutely beautiful. On this cruise, it is customary on the last night to have a talent show in which any of the passengers can participate. Carol, then 17 years old, surprised us one day by saying, "I'm going to be in the talent show tonight." Now, Carol doesn't sing, and of course she doesn't dance. So naturally, I was curious as to what she would do that night. Carol is not in the least ashamed to be seen in shorts of covers, her stump to just below the hip, but she is very conscious of the fact that people look at her out of the corners of their eyes and wonder what happened to her. On Friday evening, the night of the talent show, my wife and I sat in the lounge along with 600 other people. The talent show was scheduled to take place on the stage in the big, glorified cocktail lounge. As you can imagine, it's a very secular scene. The acts that were performed that night were typical of amateur talent shows. Then it was Carol's turn. She came on stage wearing neither shorts nor Hawaiian garb, but a full-length dress.
She
looked beautiful. She walked up to the microphone and said, "I really don't know what my talent is, but I thought this would be a good chance for me to give what I think I owe you all. And that is an explanation. I know you've been looking at me all week wondering about my fake leg. Though I should tell you what happened. I was in a motorcycle accident. I almost died, but they kept giving me blood, and my pulse came back. They amputated my leg below the knee, and later they amputated through the knee. I spent 7 months in the hospital. 7 months, with intravenous antibiotics to fight infection. She paused a moment and then continued, "If I've one talent, it is this. I can tell you that. During that time my faith became very real to me." Suddenly a hush swept over the lounge. The waitresses stopped serving drinks. The glasses stopped tinkling. Every eye was focused on this tall 17-year-old blonde. She said, "I look at you girls who walk without a limp, and I wish I could walk that way.
I
Can't, but this is what I've learned and I want to leave it with you. It's not how you walk that counts, but who walks with you and who you walk with." At that point she paused and said, "I'd like to sing a song about my friend, my Lord, and," she sang, "and he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own, and the joy we share in our time of prayer. Originally, as we tarry there, none other has ever known. Point 1. Thank you. There was not a dry eye, not a life that wasn't touched that night. Tough times never last, but tough people do. Because tough people know that with men it may appear impossible. But with God, all things are possible. What makes a person survive and thrive? Why are some people tough enough to win over their tough times? These questions have never before been as important as they are today. Because we are going through some of the toughest times that our country has ever faced. We cannot merely talk about strategies for success. We have to get down to hardcore. 22/120. Tough times never last, but tough people do. Robert H.Schuller. Principles that will work. And the only principles that we can believe in are principles that are tested, tried, and proven.
1.
Copyright 1967 by Hallmark Company. Copyright renewal 1940. Extended. The Roadheaver Company. Owner. All rights reserved.
Used by
permission. It's impossible to fail totally if you dare to try. Many of you who are reading these words do not have time to experiment. Your energies and your resources are running out. You have to be assured that the next thing you try will not be some wild and reckless whim. Possibility thinking works. It has helped countless people survive really tough times. It can help you too, because possibility thinking is not just a vague attitude. It is a hardcore principle. In this book, I will show you specifically how possibility thinking can get you through the hard time you are going through. Your life can also be the portrait of a survivor. You can make it. You can win if you carefully follow the possibility thinking plan outlined in the following chapters. The first step will be to put your problems in proper perspective. Sure, you have problems. They may be the worst you've ever faced, but chances are they are not the worst thing that could possibly have happened. No matter how bad it is, it could always be worse. Be glad it's not. Put your problem in proper perspective. Stop making a mountain out of a molehill. Everybody has problems. No life is problem-free. Now you must learn to solve and manage problems. And there is not necessarily a solution for every problem. However, every problem can be managed positively. In Chapter 4 of this book are specific guidelines on how to manage your problem creatively.
To do so, it is
necessary to take charge and control of your problems. Now, to manage means to control. Too many people lose control of their life by surrendering leadership to outside factors. We will discuss the many factors that can inadvertently take over the leadership spot in your life. Who is in control of your life? You can be in control yourself if you will follow the 10 commandments of possibility thinking. Many suggested solutions to our problems may appear impossible. Consequently, too many solutions are thrown away and never given a chance. The 10 commandments of possibility thinking can show how you can make the most of the ideas that God will give you. If it's going to be, it's up to me. Next, after you've explored and applied these principles, then you'll need to put faith to work. I'll outline for you faith's 5 phases to get you going. People who win over tough times are people who never stop believing. They have faith in themselves and their Lord and in the ideas that God gives them. These winners, survivors, pray for God's guidance and, when they know what it is they have to do, then they take action. They do something about
it.
To help you get going, the entire last part of this book is dedicated to an alphabet for action. These times we're going through are tough, but if you're going to get through them, it's up to you. You must begin to act. 23/120. Tough times never last, but tough people do. Robert H.Schuller. You say, but that's easy for you to say, Dr. Schuller. These ideas, these principles work for others. They have education. They have alternatives. They have capital. They are not in my situation. I say to you, you can do anything you want to do. You can be anything you want to be.
You
can go anywhere from where you are if you are willing to dream big and work hard. Have you ever heard of the story of the 3 negative women who lived in the bayou?
They
complained every day. We've got it bad living in this bayou. No opportunity here. Others are living in the city where they have unlimited opportunities. Us, we got nothing. This is the complaint they lived their lives by, until one day a positive thinking woman came along. After listening to the complaints, she said, nonsense. Opportunity? You want opportunity? You got opportunity. You live on the bayou. The bayou leads to the river. The river leads to the Gulf. The Gulf leads to the ocean. You can go anywhere from where you are. These are tough times you're going through, but if you're going to get through, it's up to you. Ready to go? Get ready to make your dreams come true.